All right, I will say good morning. A very, very, very exciting daf ahead of us today. Begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Nisan, Czinn Teri Kahn Czinn, for dedicating all the Shimmy Batsheva with gratitude to Hashem on welcoming their first grandchild, Adin Tzvi Hochbaum, to thank Benjamin and Elys Wohl for dedicating all of the shiurim and drashos this month. Thanking all of those who make the shir possible, specifically Moishe Abramson, Jeremy Lasson, who enable Baruch Hashem, those who aren't able to be in the Beis Midrash with us, to be able to partake in the Torah. To thank Shimmy Batsheva Messing for dedicating all the Shimon Drashos in honor of the Bas Mitzva of their daughter Lilah. To thank Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating the shiurim and drashos this month in memory of Paul's father, Shmuel ben Zechariah, his mother Leah bas Avrohom, and great-grandmother Tziril bas Rav Dov. We thank our Daf Yomi sponsors, Moishe and Abramson, for dedicating Arvei Pesachim as a schus for the Shlema for Daniel Meir ben Chana, and we thank Natan and Leah Berry for dedicating today's shir for the Refuah Shlema of David Kalman ben Tovia Hotel. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all those who require Refuah showering together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, all of the neshamas, Emir Hashem should have an aliyah, the families in Nechama, all of those reaching Bas Mitzva, Emir Hashem should do so b'sha'at tova u'metzlachas, and all of those who continue to work on behalf of the Kehillah, should Emir Hashem have the strength to do so for many years to come. All right, so with that, let us begin. A lot to do today. Today's daf is Kuf Yud Zayin 117, and we are picking up on Kuf Tes Zayin 116b, the second line in the Gemara. In the wide lines, it's 2, 4, 6 lines in. 6 lines in from when the lines get started. We'll say, so really exciting Gemara today. So Amar Rava says as follows: Matzah tzarech lagbiyah, umar tzarech lagbiyah. Both say when doing the Seder, and remember again, we just saw in the Mishnah, Rabbi Gamliel Haya Omer, Kol Shelo Amar Shlosha Dvarim Elo BePesach Lo Yatzei Dechavasa, right? We just saw this whole sugya. So we know that we go ahead. So what Rabbi Gamliel introduced us to Rabbi say is as follows. Apparently, it is not, and we're going to talk about this in greater depth, it is not just enough to go ahead and eat your maror, and it's not just enough to go ahead and eat your matzah, and it's not just enough to eat your Pesach. There is a dialogical component attached to these items. And halacha l'maisa, I have to go ahead and there must be some type of recitation. I have to say something. This is incredibly important. We'll say, by the way, why is that? Why? Think about this for just a moment. Why does Rabbi Gamliel say you have to say something, right? Kol shelo amar shlosha devarim elu yatzei dechavas. Why do you have to say it? And again, now according to Rava, by the way, you have to pick it up. So okay, so we'll talk about the dibur Meretz Hashem a little bit later on. But the point that Rav is making is there's a dibur and there's a hagbah. There's a lifting up. So the Gemara says you have to lift. So Rav says you have to lift up matzah. You have to lift up maror, basar in tzarech lagbiyah. But you don't lift up the meat. You don't lift up the meat. I will say, obviously, at this point in time when Rav is speaking, there's no Beis Hamikdash, there's no Korban Pesach, and all I have is a piece of meat that is there zecher to the carbon. So Rava says you dafka don't pick up that piece of meat. Not only that, Rava says you're not allowed to pick up the piece of meat. Why? Because it has the appearance that Allah Chalamaisi you're eating consecrated or sacrificial items outside of the Beis Hamikdash. If you take a look at the Rashbam, so the Rashbam says Basra in tzarech lagbiyah v'lo od ela shenir k'makdash behemto in tzarech lagbiyah. First of all, you can't say Pesach Zeh because that piece of meat is not your Korban Pesach. Furthermore, again, I will say the act of lifting it up might actually appear as if you are consecrating something, which of course is prohibited. And I will say this we know is halacha l'maisa in our practice as well today when we do Rabbi Gamliel. So some pick up, but more often people point, right? Masazu, marurzu. When it comes to Pesach, we're careful not only to not lift up, but also not even to point to the particular piece of meat. Incredible. Amrav Acha Bar Yaakov, Suma Patim Lomar Haggadah. We'll say this is fascinating. A blind person is exempt from reading the Haggadah. Good. They're both saying, now the truth is, in general, we see a concept in halacha of summa pater mitzvos, that a blind person is patur from mitzvahs. But you're going to see there's a special limud over here. Ksiv hacha, it says over here, ba'avur zeh, right? By Pesach, it says, because of this, Hashem took me out of Mitzrayim. Ksiv hasam, interestingly enough, by Ben Sorer Umora, by the rebellious son, Benenu zeh. Our son, remember, the parents bring the son to Beis Din, and they say, Benenu zeh, this son is a Ben Sorer Umora. He is wayward and rebellious. Ma'ala halan prat l'suma. So we'll say the Gemara darshins that by Ben Sorer Umora, the parents can't be blind. In order to say Benenu zeh, this son, they're pointing to a particular child, they can't be blind. So afkan prat l'suma, so too by Pesach, a blind person is pater. So we'll say essentially it's Gzerah of zeh zeh. Ba'avor zeh, Benenu zeh. Just like by Ben Sorer Umora, the parents have to have sight, so too again, by Pesach, in order to say the Haggadah, you have to have sight. Ini, is that so? V'amar Mereimar, but yet Mereimar said, Shout to the Rabban of the Rav Yosef, Manda Ami Agarata be Rav Yosef. Yet Mereimar said, I asked the members of Rav Yosef's home, who said Haggadah? Who led the Seder in Rav Yosef's home? And what happened? Rav Yosef, Manda Amar Agarata be Rav Sheshes. And who led the Seder in Rav Shesh's home? Amar, then they responded, Rav Sheshes. Now both said Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshes were blind. They were both blind. So Mereimar said, I inquired about two great Rabbanim who were blind, about who led Seder in their homes. And sure enough, both of them went ahead and led the Seder. So the Gemara says, well, maybe, Kasavi Rabbanim Matzah Bizman Hazeh Rabbanon. Ultimately, again, Bepashtos, maybe these particular rabbis held that Halacha L'Maisa, Matzah today is only D'Rabbanon. Maybe they hold that in the absence of Karban Pesach, even matzah is only D'Rabbanon. And if it's only D'Rabbanon, even a summa could go ahead and lead the Seder. So we'll say, is that to say that Rav Yaakov, who says that a summa can't lead the Seder, he holds that matzah is D'Oraisa. Yet Rav Yaakov says, he's on record as saying that matzah is D'Rabbanon. To which the Gemara says, kasavar, called the tikkun rabbanon came to Araisa tikkun. Rav Acha says it's true. Matzah bisman hazeh d'Rabbanon, but when Chazal institute a halacha, they institute it like a d'Oraisa. And therefore, you have to treat it like a d'Oraisa. Therefore, Rav Acha bar Yaakov says a summa should not lead the Seder. So the Gemara says, Hachi hashta bishlam hasam. I'm sorry. Rav Sheshes, Rav Yosef Nami Havadai called the tikkun rabbanon came d'Oraisa tikkun. But according to Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshes, who are blind, wouldn't they subscribe to the same idea that even if you hold that matzah d'Rabbanon, when Chazal institute a halacha, they institute it like a d'Oraisa, and therefore halacha l'maisa, if a summa is not permitted to lead the Seder when matzah is a d'Oraisa, you shouldn't even be able to lead it when it's a d'Rabbanon. To which the Gemara says, Hachi ashta bishlama hasam idahavi le'michtav b'neinuhu uksiv b'neinu zeh shmamina prat l'sumin hu da'asa. So both sides, the Gemara says it's not a fair comparison. All of this is based on a Gzerah Shava between Ben Sorer Umora and Pesach, but it's not fair. I'll tell you why. By Ben Sorer Umora, the pasuk is Benenu Zeh, Ben Sorer Umora. So where does the drasha from Ben Sorer Umora come from? Because what could the pasuk have said? Benenu Hu, this son of ours, he is a Ben Sorer Umora. But instead, the Torah says Benenu Zeh. Zeh, Rabbi say, we see this very apropos as well by the Shira, by Az Yashir. What do we say? Zeh keli vanveyu. And what does Rashi HaKadosh say? Zeh keli vanveyu, heralo be'etzba. That literally there was such a manifestation of the divine presence that people were able to point to the Shechina. So the word zeh, certainly in the biblical context, refers to something that you are able to see and to identify. So by Ben Sorer Umora, the pasuk could have just as easily said Benenu Hu, this is our son. The fact that it says Benenu Zeh indicates that it's telling us that the parents must be able to see their child, and if they're blind, there is no Ben Sorer Umora. However, Aval Hacha Ilav Ba'avor Zeh My Lichtov. But again, over here by Pesach, remember, we're trying to tell the child Ba'avor Zeh Asa Hashem li b'tzei simim. Because of this. The pashtus that this is Pesach Matzah and Maror. Because of this, so we'll say there is no other way to phrase it. There is no other way to phrase it. Ela ba'avor matzah maror hu da'asa. Therefore, we'll say ultimately again, Rav Acha bar Yaakov abandons this position. A summa is permitted to go ahead and lead the Seder. Now again, a summa's general obligation in mitzvahs is subject to an incredible amount of halachic dispute, right? Again, I will say in general, it's fascinating to see that, we have in halacha that, let's say, for example, a cheresh, right? A cheresh or an iva or a suma, so a person who's blind, a person who's deaf, in the eyes of Chazal, often was patur from many things. There's much contemporary literature now, because Baruch Hashem, thank God, even if a person is deaf or a person is blind, or even if a person is deaf and blind, there are so many ways in which they could go ahead and be part of the world, and clearly, again, are able to develop das. So again, just pointing out interesting ideas. In any event, Rav Acha Bar Yaakov abandons his position. We'll see, just on a hashkafic level, there's a profound idea, I think, over here, that Rav Acha Bar Yaakov wanted to say that a summa, someone who's blind, is patur from saying the Haggadah. I will say, a lot of times in life, a person could have 20/20 vision, but yet be totally blind to life. So Rav Acha Bar Yaakov says, if you're blind, you can't really say the Haggadah, right? If you don't have a full understanding of the Ribono Shel Olam, and you're blind to the realities of life, and you're not living your life in the way that you're supposed to, so what meaning does the Pesach Seder have to you? And the Gemara essentially goes on to say, there are many people who are blind who say the Haggadah. Do you know what I both say? Because the great thing in life is the Ribono Shel Olam does not demand perfection. So I could go ahead and try to make the most of my Pesach experience, even though I'm pretty blind going through life. Even though at the end of the day, I ignore a lot of my shortcomings, I ignore a lot of my opportunities, I ignore a lot of things. I'm blind to a lot of things in life, but just because I'm blind the rest of the year doesn't prevent me ultimately from actualizing my sight on the Leil HaSeder. Yiddishkeit is not an all or nothing proposal. It's not either you're in or you're out. Certainly, again, on some level, I have to have a commitment to the Ribono Shel Olam. But again, most of us are blind in one way or another. But that doesn't preclude us from trying our best in the other areas of life in which we have sight. So the Gemara goes weiter. Lefichach anachnu chayavin. Therefore, again, the Mishnah said we are obligated to go ahead and give shevach, give praise to Hashem. Top of Kof Yud Zayin. I both say, here we go. Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Halaluka, v'kes ka, v'yedid ya achasein. So we'll say we're going to now see something very interesting, that we're going to have a couple of words. So just obviously halaluka, we know that word. Kes ya is, or kes ka, is actually by the war with Amalek. Right? The pasuk says, Vayomer kiyad al kes ka milchama Hashem Amalek midardar. So we'll say the way we normally translate kes ka means the throne, kisei, the throne of Hashem. Yedidya was the name of Shlomo HaMelech. So there's a discussion now. Are these words one word or two words? You'll see why it matters in just a moment. So Rav Chisda said in Rabbi Yochanan, achasein, they're all one word. Rav Amar, kes ya umerchav ka achasein. Rav says, kes ka, merchav ka are one word. So the Rava Amar merchav ka bilvad. Rava says no. Rabba says only merchav ka by itself. Ibailuhu merchav ka Rav Chisda mai. We'll say what about merchav ka ultimately to Rav Chisda? What's its status? One word or two words? Teku. The Gemara says it's a kasha. Ibailuhu yedidya l'Rav mai. What does Rav hold about the name yedidya? Is it one word or is it two words? We'll say you're going to see why this is important. Is a number of reasons. Number one, how to write it. How to write it. Do you write it as one word or do you write it as two words? It also makes a difference als shemus. Als shemus. Right? So technically speaking, again, can you discard items that, we'll see. I don't have to get ahead. So the Gemara says, Tashma, Adam Rav, Yedidya nechlach l'shnayim. Rav says the name Yedidya is written as Yedid, and ultimately again, then Yud Hey afterwards. Lefichach, Yedid chol ka kodesh. We'll say, here you go. If it's two words, if you did just two words, then ultimately, again, you did. Chol means profane, meaning the idea is that word doesn't have any inherent kedusha, but of course, Yud and then Hey, the name of Hashem, will have kedusha. Ibailahu halaluka l'Rav mai. We'll say, what about the word halaluka? One word or two words? Tashma da amarav chazina tili debe chavivi. We'll say, this is so beautiful. So Rav said, I saw tili. We'll say means the Sefer Tehillim. I saw the Sefer Tehillim of my uncle. Rav's uncle was Rav Chia. I saw my uncle's Tehillim, Dichsiv Behu, Halalu Bechad Gisa. It said Halalu on one line, Vika Bechad Gisa, and they had Ka on a different line, which would seem to indicate to us what? That Halaluka is two words. Two words. I will say first, I just want to point out how beautiful this is. That Rav bringing a raya, no. Yeah, right. They're bringing a raya from his uncle's Tehillim. Right, so what a beautiful imagery. I saw my uncle's Sefer Tehillim. Right, so that it's so beautiful. Not normally the way we bring a raya. Imagine looking in the Tehillim of an ancestor. So he says, I saw my uncle's Tehillim, and it was written 2 lines. Upliga Rabbi Shimon Levi, my hallelujah, hallelu behilulim harbe. And also Rabbi Shimon Levi disagrees, because Rabbi Shimon Levi says that hallelujah is one word. And in fact, what the word means is praise HaKadosh Baruch Hu with many praises. Upliga didei, and Rabbi Shimon Levi contradicts himself. Don't Rabbi Shimon Levi, basara ma'amaro shel shevach ne'emar Sefer Tehillim. That there are 10 forms of praise which are recited in Sefer Tehillim. What are they? Benitzuach. So we'll say benitzuach means lam natzeach. Benigun, beneginos, lam naginos. Bemaskil, bemizmar, beshir, ba'ashrei, b'tehila, b'tfila, b'hodah. So we'll say these are all the different words that are used to highlight praise in Sefer Tehillim. And the Gemara says, or Rabbi Shimon Levi says, "Hallelujah, gadol mikulon." Ultimately, again, the greatest one is Hallelujah. Why? So Hallelujah shekolol shem v'shevach b'bas achos. Because ultimately, again, Hallelujah includes both the name of Hashem as well as the praise of Hashem in one word. So we'll say again another ayah that it's one word. Amar Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Shir Shebetorah. So we'll say, so now the Gemara transitions a little bit and focuses on something incredibly amazing. Shir Shebetorah. We'll say Az Yashir. Az Yashir. That's the Shira in the Torah. The truth is there are 2 Shiras in the Torah. There's Az Yashir and there's Hazinu. Right? But Az Yashir, who said it? Shir Shebetorah. Moshe v'Yisrael Amru b'Shash Alu ben Hayam. Moshe Rabbeinu and Klal Yisrael said it when they came out of the Yam Suf. V'Halal Zim Miyamru. So we'll say this is actually very interesting. And who said Halal? Who composed Halal as we have it today? So Nevi'im Shebeinehem Tiknu Lahen Yisrael. So was the Nevi'im amongst them. So we'll say it's actually very interesting. So bepashtos, that what meaning when it's in the Nevi'im Shebeinehem, the prophets among them, is that referring to the prophets who were among the Jewish people when we came out of the Yam Suf? Were there Nevi'im amongst Klal Yisrael? So again, we'll have to clarify this. But the prophets who were amongst them, Tiknu Lahen Yisrael, Shu'omid Osa Kol Perek Uperek Va'al Kol Tzara V'Tzara. So the Nevi'im within Klal Yisrael instituted that Halal should be recited at every time as a result of every tzara shal tava alein ucheshenik alin omrim also al Lasson. So we'll say the Nevi'im in Klal Yisrael instituted that Halal should be recited every time we experience a difficulty, every time we experience an existential threat, and we are saved. Halal is the proper response. Tanyo. So Gemara calls the rise. Hayrei Meir Omer Kol Sushbachos Ha'amuros B'Sefer Tehillim Kulon David Amnon. So we'll say what we have so far is again Az Yashir. Klal Yisrael and Moshe Rabbeinu said it when coming out of the Yam Suf. Halal Nevi'im Shebeinehim, the prophets amongst Klal Yisrael. It's possible that it's referring to, once again, the prophets amongst Klal Yisrael who were by Yam Suf, because we'll say, remember again, all of Klal Yisrael to a certain degree was zocha to a level of nevuah when we went through Yam Suf. So it's possible that the Gemara is suggesting that maybe Halal was instituted then, or it could also just mean that in general the Nevi'im of Klal Yisrael, not referring to any specific time, but the Nevi'im of Klal Yisrael made the Halal. Tanya, Hayre Meir Omer, Kol Sushbachos Hamuros B'Sefer Tehillim, Kulan David Amron. So Moshe Meir says all of the praises in Sefer Tehillim were all said by David. Shnei Amar, because the pasuk says, Kalu Tfilos David ben Yishai. Al Tikri Kalu Ella Kol Elu. So this is actually very interesting. So there's a pasuk in Sefer Tehillim. We read it as Kalu Tfilos David ben Yishai. The Tfilos, the prayers of David, the son of Yishai, end. But the Gemara says, don't read it as Kalu, but rather read it as Kol Elu. Everything included in Sefer Tehillim was written by David HaMelech. Now I will say, this reading also makes a little bit more sense because this statement of Kalu Tfilos David ben Yishai is in Kapitel Ayin Daled 74. So when you read that, it looks like David HaMelech only wrote the first 74 Kapitel, first half of Sefer Tehillim. Now when we interpret the pasuk to mean Kol Elu, everything was written by David HaMelech. The entire say was written by David. Halal Zemi Amr. So who said Halal? So once again, we're going back to Halal for just a moment. Who said Halal? Rabbi Yossi. So the Gemara says, Mi Amru. Rabbi Yossi Omer. Elazar b'ni Omer. So Rabbi Yossi quotes his son. Interesting. Elazar, my son, said, Moshe the Yisrael Amru b'Shash Alu min Hayam. This is incredible. Who said, we'll say, who created Hallel or who coined Hallel? Moshe and Klal Yisrael when we came out of the Red Sea. V'chalukin alav chaver of Lomar. David Amru. But my son Elazar's friends, his friends disagree with him, and he says, no, it wasn't Moshe and Klal Yisrael who made Hallel, but rather what? It was David HaMelech. V'nirin dvarav midivrehen. And ultimately, and Abba listen to this. Rabbi Yossi says, I think my son is more right than them. Why, Abba? This is incredible. Efshar Yisrael shachtu es pischehen v'natlu es lulavehen v'lo amru shira. So let's listen to this, because Rabbi Yossi says, is it possible that for all of those years before David HaMelech, Jews took their lulav and Jews shechted their Korban Pesach and they didn't say Hallel? But we've seen this type of theme before. Is it, see, what Rabbi Yossi can't believe is, until David HaMelech, no one said Hallel? No one said Hallel. So what did Jews do? And they did mitzvahs. How did they just not spontaneously burst into Hallel? We spoke about this before, that this type of statement is incredible. It's almost as if Hallel is the reflexive reaction to spiritual service. That when you realize that you have a privilege to serve the Ribono Shel Olam, when I realize what it means to have a Torah, what it means to have mitzvos, what it means to have a relationship with the Melech Malchei Hamlochim, the natural response is Hallel. It's not the pshat. So Rabbi Yossi is saying is, what are you talking about? Who codified Hallel? Hallel is the natural, reflexive, spiritual response when you realize the enormity of the spiritual privilege that we possess in life. So it's impossible to think that David HaMelech was the first person to come up with this. I will say, and I'll tell you something very interesting. So this is actually a very dramatic Gemara, because here we have now an opinion when it comes to Hallel. So again, Az Yashir we've got Sefer Tehillim, so far pretty much we have as well, David HaMelech. Hallel, we have again Rabbi Yossi quoting his son saying it was Klal Yisrael when they came out of Yam Suf. Second opinion, which is everybody else, saying no, Hallel is part of Tehillim. And therefore, again, it was also made or put together by David HaMelech. So it's interesting, in the Shailas of Tshuvas Chul Me'ava, he asked a question, it's actually the Maharsha's question. He says, how can you say that it was Klal Yisrael who came out of the Yam Suf who said Hallel? There are phrases in there that don't make all that much sense. Beis Aaron betchu b'Hashem. Beis Aaron betchu b'Hashem. That doesn't come till later on. So the Tshuva Me'ava gives a very interesting answer. Tshuva Me'ava brings down, he says, when we say that Klal Yisrael, who came out of the Yam Suf, made Tehillim, created Hallel, concretized Hallel, we'll say it doesn't literally have to mean that they went ahead and arranged the words. Rather, what does it mean? They developed the conceptual framework. The conceptual framework being that after you experience some type of salvational deliverance, there is an idea of praising the Ribono Shel Olam. And that's why even when the Gemara says, when Rabbi Yossi says, could it be that Klal Yisrael took their lulav, did their Pesach, and never said Hallel? It doesn't have to mean the words of Hallel as we have it today. It means the concept of Hallel. Both said, in other words, essentially, there's the construct of Hallel and the concept of Hallel. It's quite possible that the construct of Hallel, as we know it today, which is made up of kapit lach tilim, wasn't made until David HaMelech. That's quite possible. But the concept of Hallel, the concept of praising the Ribono Shel Olam when something dramatically amazing happens, that has to be as old as Klal Yisrael. So Rabbi say this is the same concept that we see in the Gemara Maseches Brachos, when the Gemara says that Avram instituted Shachris. Right? So what's the first kasha? Avram Avinu constituted Shachris. How long did it take? Right? What did he do? A 28-minute one, a 30-minute one, a 35-minute one? How long? Well, so obviously, it doesn't mean that Avram Avinu daven Shachris like we have Shachris, or that Yitzchak daven Mincha. Shmona Esrei Zayin Shekin is Sagadola. Many generations later, it means they developed the conceptual framework for morning, afternoon, and evening prayer. But of course, they didn't daven what we daven. That's obvious. So the Shulman Ava writes over here that again, same idea, according to this opinion, that Klal Yisrael, Rabbi Yossi says that Klal Yisrael went ahead and made up Hallel when they crossed the sea, not the words, not the construct, but the concept. So the Gemara goes right to Tanabanon. Kol Shios Shbachol Shamer David B'Sofo B'Sefer Tehillim. All of the different things that David HaMelech wrote in Sefer Tehillim, the Gemara says Rabbi Lezer Omer Kineged Atzman Omran. Sefer Tehillim corresponds to David HaMelech's life. Every single kapitel somehow reflects something in his life. Rabbi Yeshua Keneged Tzibor Amar. Rabbi Yeshua says, no, he wrote it corresponding to the Tzibor of Klal Yisrael. It's not about David personally, but rather it's about the experience of the Klal. The Chum say both. Yeshua Keneged Tzibor, Yeshua Keneged Atzmo. There are some kapitlach, ultimately again, that David HaMelech wrote corresponding to specific events in his life, and some kapitlach that ultimately correspond to the Klal. Ha'amuros b'loshen yochid keneged atzmo, ha'amuros b'loshen rabim keneged tzibor. And very simple, how do you know which is which? So Rabbi Yeshua posits, the Chum posit, that halacha l'maisa, ones that are written in plural correspond to Klal Yisrael, ones that are written in the singular correspond to the individual. Ha'amuros, so the Gemara goes weiter. So v'nitzuach v'nigun la'asid lavo. Also, by the way, when David HaMelech introduces a capital lam natseach or lam neginos, that refers to the future, which I will say, by the way, just so you should know, what does lam natseach mean, or lam naginos? Lam natseach means to the conductor, right? The conductor of who? The conductor of the Levitic choir. David HaMelech wrote Sefer Tehillim to be sung by the Levitic choir in the Beis Hamikdash, because what David HaMelech wanted more than anything in life was to be able to build the Beis Hamikdash. The one thing that he wanted most was the one thing that the Ribono Shel Olam said no to. We'll say it's an incredible drama to this. The one thing Moshe Rabbeinu wanted most, to enter into Eretz Yisrael, Kadosh Baruch Hu said no. The one thing David HaMelech wanted most, to build the Beis Hamikdash, the Ribono Shel Olam said no. But amazingly enough, and here's the incredible life lesson of David HaMelech, just because you can't do exactly what you want does not mean you should not do something. So David HaMelech couldn't build the Beis Hamikdash, but he did everything else. He bought the real estate, and he composed every piece of music for the Levitic choir. Everything that the Leviim ever sang in Emir Hashem Hira B'Yameinu will sing again comes from David HaMelech. An incredible life lesson. Just because you can't do what you want doesn't mean that you are exempt from accomplishing anything. So the Gemara goes weiter. So Nigun v'nitzuach lasid lavo maskil ayidei turgamon. The David Mizmar, so we'll say it's also so beautiful. What does it mean, the David Mizmar? So we'll say, remember again, there's some kapitach, there are the David Mizmar, some Mizmar the David. We'll say, get ready for this. Life-altering Gemara. The David Mizmar, Melamed Sheshar Salav Shechina v'achar kach Amar Shira. So we'll say, when you see the David Mizmar, it means that David HaMelech was in a state of inspiration. Literally, again, the Shechina rested upon him, and then he sang. Mizmar le David, Melamed Amar Shira v'achar kach Shar Salav Shechina. When it's Mizmar le David, it means David HaMelech had to self-inspire. But you hear this chilik? The David Mizmar is David HaMelech was already inspired and then began to sing. Mizmar le David, David HaMelech needed music, as we're going to see, in order to get himself into a state of inspiration. The Gemara says, "L'amdecha shena shchina shor lo mitoch atzlos, lo mitoch atzlos, v'lo misoch atzvos, v'lo misoch schok, v'lo misoch kalos rosh." Both you learn from here that the Shechina only rests upon a person, or the Shechina does not rest upon a person. From atzlos, laziness, atzvos, sadness, schok, levity, kalos rosh, lightheadedness, and any davar batal, only way to have the Shechina rest upon you is simcha shel mitzvah, joy. And we'll say you have to be in a state of simcha. What type of simcha? Simcha that comes from a mitzvah. Shene Amar, Va'ata kichuli minagim, Vayakin agina minagim ati alav yalasham. We'll say this is actually a pasuk by the Navi Elisha, that Elisha, when he wanted a spirit of prophecy, was sometimes called for the musician. Tell the musician to come, play the music, and put me in the right state of mind for prophecy. I will say two incredible yisodos that come in here. First of all, the need to be besimcha. They need to be besimcha. When a person is not besimcha, the Shechina is not shora. A person cannot have a real relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam if a person is not in a state of simcha. Now, what simcha means from a Jewish perspective is a different discussion. It certainly doesn't always mean being glad or being joyful. Simcha is a much deeper state of ultimately when I feel that my life has meaning. But again, that's not for today. But what I do want to tell you is something incredibly important. This yisod of Mizmor LeDavid versus LeDavid Mizmor, I will say in Chasidus, this is called Isarusa de Leah and Isarusa de Latasa. In Chasidus, there are two different forms of inspiration. There's inspiration from above and inspiration from below. Sometimes the Ribono Shel Olam sends a wave of inspiration over me. We all experience this, right? Sometimes I just feel inspired. Sometimes I just feel spiritually connected, and I don't even know particularly where it came from. That's called Isarusa de Le'ila, an awakening from above. That's a gift, a matana, from the Ribono Shel Olam, and that's incredible. But sometimes in life, the tidal wave of spiritual energy is not coming. And what I have to do is self-inspire. I have to self-inspire. I can't spend my life sitting on the couch waiting for the tidal wave of divine energy. I must self-inspire. That's called Isarusa Dilatas, an awakening from below. And I will say what you see over here is even the great David HaMelech experienced that as well. LeDavid Mizmar, he was inspired. The Rosh Hashanah inspired him and he sang. But Mizmar LeDavid, in those moments, ultimately again, when he was not inspired, what did he do? He inspired himself. Rabbi say a person is never allowed to say, I'm just not inspired. Okay, well, I should say, sometimes, of course, there are times I'm not inspired. The shaila is, after I make that statement, now, what am I doing about it? So Rabbi say, so sometimes I live a life of David Mizmar. I'm feeling it, and I'm singing it. And sometimes in life, I'm living a life of Mizmar LeDavid. I'm not feeling it, but I'm going to do whatever I can to feel it. I'm going to self-inspire, and then Emirat Hashem move on to my avodas Hashem. Incredible. So Gemara goes right to Amar Yehuda Amar Rav. V'chein ledvar halacha. Same thing, that just like you need to be b'simcha in order to go ahead and have hashras hashchina, we'll say when giving over halacha, when teaching Torah. Teaching Torah, a person should teach Torah in a state of simcha. This is great. Both say this is beautiful. So too for dreams. If you want to have sweet dreams, what do you need to do? Go to bed happy. Go to bed happy, right? If you go to bed happy, or just put yourself in a state of simcha, and good things happen. You'll have hashras hashchina, you'll have a shchina, you'll be able to teach Torah, you'll have good dreams. Ini is this so Rav Gila Amarav Kol Tam Kacham Yoshe Bnei Rabo Vein Sif So Sub Notfo Smart Techavena Beit Rav Gila said the name of Rab. That any Talmid Chacham who sits in front of his Rebbe, and literally again his lips are not dripping with dread. Ultimately, again, Techavena will be burnt. We'll say so. This clearly paints a picture that when you learn Torah, you're not supposed to be in a state of simcha, right? You're supposed to go ahead and what? You're supposed to be in a state of like awe and reverence. Sheneh Mar Sif Sosav Shoshan Notvo Smar over Al Tikri Shoshanim Ela Shoshonim Al Tikri Mar over Elamar over Lokashya Habarabba Habatamida. To which the Gemara says two different people. The Talmud is supposed to be sitting learning Torah in a state of awe. The Rebbe is supposed to be in a state of simcha when he's conveying the Torah. Because if the Rebbe is in a state of simcha, he's more effectively and excitedly able to convey that Torah. The possibility is Hava Haba Rabba. Both are talking about the Rebbe. Kasha Ha Mikamei de Pasach Hala Basar de Pasach. This is interesting. There's also maybe a difference in the disposition of the Rebbe before he begins this year and after he begins this year. The Gemara says, Ki had the Rabba Mikamei de Pasach Lul Rabbana Amamilsa de Michusa. Rabba, before he began this year, he would say a joke, he would say something humorous, Ubad Rabbanan, and the rabbis would laugh. Then the rabbis would get serious, right? And they would go ahead and transition into a state of greater awe, and then he would begin to learn. So maybe it's possible the Gemara is saying is, in order to draw people in to learn, you have to start with simcha, you start with a little humor, then once they're drawn in, then ultimately again the experience transforms into one of awe. Tan Rabbanan. Halal Zumi Amru. Who said halal? Rabbi Elazar Omer. Moshe v'Yisrael amru b'shasha amdu al hayam. Moshe and Klal Yisrael said it at the time that they stood at the Red Sea. So the Gemara says, b'shasha amdu al hayam. So listen to this. So the Gemara says, let me see it differently. B'shasha amdu al hayam heim amru lo lanu Hashem lo lanu. When we stood at the sea and we needed the sea to split, we said, Lo lanu Hashem lo lanu. Yibon Shalom, don't do it for us. Don't do it for us. We don't have the schus, but do it for you. Meshiva ruach hakodesh v'amar lahen lema'ani es. And the Shekhinah responded to us and said, Klal Yisrael, I will split the sea for my own sake. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Yoshua v'Yisrael amru. B'shash amdu alei malchei Canaan. Yoshua and Klal Yisrael said it when they had to face the Canaanite kings. Heim amru lo lanu. So Yoshua and Klal Yisrael said, Lo lanu Hakadosh Baruch Hu, don't do it for us. Don't do it just for us. Again, don't do it for us. Umeshiva and the Shekhinah responded, Lema'ani es. Rabbi Elazar Hamodi Omer Dvora ubarak amru b'shah amad aleim sisra. So Moshe comes along Rabbi Elazar and he says that it was Devora and Barak. They're the ones who said halal when they had to face down Sisra. Heim amru lo lanu. So ultimately, again, they said to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ribbono Shel Olam, don't save us for our sake, but rather save us for yours. HaKadosh Baruch Baruch HaKodesh Meshiva V'omeres Lahem Lema'ani Es. And sure enough, the Shekhinah responded and said, okay, I will redeem you from my sake. In other words, even if the klal doesn't deserve it, I will go ahead and redeem you for my own sake. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer Chizkiah v'Siyaito Amra b'Shasha Amar Aleim Sanchiriv. Heim Amru Lo Lanu u'Meshiba. So we'll say what happened. It was Chizkiah Melech Yehuda, when Sanchiriv marched on Yerushalayim, and Chizkiah says, Ribono Shel Olam, please, Lo Lanu, don't save us for our sake. And the Shekhinah responds, I will save you for my sake. Rabbi Akiva Omer Chananyo Mishal v'Azariah Amru b'Shasha Amar Aleim Nebuchadnezzar HaRasha. Rabbi Akiva says it was Chananya, Mishael, and Azariah when Nebuchadnezzar stood up, opposed them. Amru lo lanu u'meshiva. Good. Rabbi Yosef Lili Omer Mordechai be'Esther Amrua b'Shash Amad Aleim Haman Arasha Heim Amru lo lanu u'meshiva. So we'll say, so again, this is incredible, because what do you see? The same capital of Tehillim, and yet differences of opinion that span throughout the entirety of Jewish history. We've just gone from Moshe Rabbeinu and Klal Yisrael at Yam Suf to Mordechai and Esther. The Chum is saying, Nevi'im shebeneim tiknu amon sheYisrael she'omrim osa kol perek u'perek va'al kol tzara v'tzara shelo tov aleim liYisrael k'shenagalan omrim osa gulas. So we'll say, what we see is as follows. We see a fundamental dispute as to when exactly halal itself was codified, right? And then, so we attach it to different historical events, and then there's the opinion of the Chum. The opinion of the Chum was that the creation of halal was, for lack of a word, I'm going to use this word, a generic institution. Generic institution meaning Chazal, the Nevi'im instituted halal. And when did they say halal? Anytime we face an existential danger and we are saved, halal is the appropriate response. Good, beautiful. Gemara says, Amrav Chista, halaluka sof pirka. So we'll say, now this is very interesting. What happens when you see a halaluka at the end of Tehillim? So is halaluka the end of one kapitel or the beginning of a new kapitel, right? Where do you put the halaluka? So listen to this. So the Gemara says, Amrav Chista, halaluka sof pirka. Whenever you see halaluka, that's there to close out a chapter of Tehillim. Rabbi Bar Rafuna Amra halaluka reish pirka. Rabbi Bar says, no, halaluka is the beginning of a parak. Amrav Chista, chazina lehu letili debei Rav Chanin. So Rav Chista said, I saw the Tehillim of Rav Chanin. Barav dichsiv behu halaluka beemtza pirka. And I saw halaluka in the middle of a paragraph. Alma Misafkale. So obviously I will say, what was the issue of here? Rav Chanin wasn't sure where to put the halalukas. So in his Sefer Tehillim, he kind of had it dangling there in the middle. He wasn't sure, does it belong? Is it the last word of the previous kapitel? Is it the first word of the next kapitel? Amar Chaim Barava, Kol Modim, B'Tehilas Hashem Yidaber Pi, V'Yivarech Kabas Hashem Kachol Yolam Va'ed, Va'anachnu Nevarechka, Me'ata V'Ad Olam, right? Halaluka, that Halaluka de Basrei Reish Pirka. So everybody agrees that the Halaluka at the end of Ashrei ultimately again begins to the next paragraph. Redi Gemara says as follows: Rasha Yira Vekas Shinavi Icharek V'Namas Tavas Hasham Tovar Halaluka de Basrei. The halaluka that follows that particular pasuk, Reish Pirka, is the beginning of the next parak. Usha'om de meveis Hashem halaluka de basrei Reish Pirka. So Gemara is just giving certain examples where apparently everyone agrees that the halaluka that quote unquote follows the particular kapitel is not the end of one kapitel, or rather the beginning of the next. Krai mosif and elu, those who are familiar with Tanakh, add on a couple of extras. Minachaba derech yishal kein yorim rosh halaluka de basrei Reish Pirka. The halaluka that follows that pasuk really belongs to the next kapitel. Reishis chacham yiras Hashem seichel tov l'cholosehem. Halaluka de basrei, the halaluka that follows that particular pasuk, Reish Pirka, is really the beginning of the next parak. So we'll say maybe this is a machlokes tonight about how to go ahead and attach the halalukas to the various prakim. So the Gemara says Ad Heichon hu Omer. So we'll say now going back to Pesachim. Remember we had a machlokes in the Mishnah about how much of halal do you recite before the meal. So the Gemara says Ad Heichon hu Omer Beishai Omrim Ad Im Habanim Smecha. So Beis Shammai says you say until Im Habanim Smecha, right? The end of the first paragraph. Ubeisila omrim ad chalomish lamaynomayim v'tanya idach ad heichan hu omer. Till how long do you say? Beishamay omrim ad b'tzeis shamim tzayim. So this is interesting. In this alternate version, it says. See, in the first version, it says eim abanu smech, which is the last line of the first paragraph. In the second version, it says until b'tzeis Yisrael. Now, both say when you look at that, you say to yourself, "What's the difference between the two? What's the difference between the two?" At first glance, Nothing. They're saying the same thing. But watch this. So we'll say, my Amud Beis, my love Hakim. We'll say, what are the two versions arguing about? So according to the first version that said Beis Shammai says, you only say until Ema Banim Smecha, Savar Halaluka Reish Pirka. Says Dafka meant until Ema Banim Smecha, and it doesn't add Halaluka. It doesn't say Ema Banim Smecha Halaluka, because that first opinion will hold that Halaluka is actually part of the next paragraph. It's not the end of the previous, but it's the beginning of the first. However, but the second brisa that said, according to Beis Shammai, you're going to say until Beis Yisrael, he holds what? Sabra Halaluka, Sof Pirka. He holds the Halaluka actually belongs to the end of the first paragraph. So I want to be clear. What the two versions of Beis Shammai are not substantively arguing. They're both saying that according to Beis Shammai, how much of halal do you say before the meal? How much? First paragraph. Interestingly enough, they're just phrasing it differently. The first opinion says that according to Beis Shammai, you say until Ema Banim Smecha, and the second opinion says you say until Beis Yisrael. Until Beis Yisrael. So the Gemara is suggesting, what's the nafkamina? Maybe the nafkamina is just halaluka. Where does halaluka go? According to the first opinion, who says until Ema Banim Smecha, halaluka is attached to the next kapitel. According to the opinion that says Beis Yisrael, halaluka is attached to the previous kapitel. To which the Gemara says, Rav Silber says no. Everyone agrees that halaluka ultimately again belongs to the previous paragraph. So why do they phrase it differently? So what's according to the second brisa that said that Beis Shammai says you say halal until B'tzeis Yisrael, so that formulation makes sense because then the halaluka belongs to the previous chapter or the previous paragraph. And the one who says until Ema Banim Smecha ad ve'ad bichlav. We'll say back to our brachas days, right? When it says until Ema Banim Smecha, it means up until and what? And including that entire phrase through halaluka, v'neima ad halaluka. So why don't you just say until halaluka? In other words, why be ambiguous with your wording? Why not just say until halaluka? V'chitema d'lo yadinan hey halaluka. Maybe because we're afraid if you say that until Beis Shammai, if Beis Shammai says you say until halaluka, we don't know which halaluka that refers to. V'neima halaluka shel ema banim smecha. Why don't you just say what you mean? Just be say good Musar in life. Why don't you just say what you mean? So why don't you just say that Beis Shammai says you say until Ema Banim Smecha Halaluka. Just say that. Then it's explicit. To which the Gemara says kasha. That's a good kasha. That's a good kasha. Rabbi Rav Huna tries to tell you. So also Rabbi Rav Huna, he answers this according to his reasoning as well. D'choli ama halaluka reish pirka. Everyone agrees that halaluka belongs at the beginning of the next chapter. Man damar at ema banim smecha shapir. So the opinion that says that according to Beis Shammai you see until ema banim smecha, that formulation makes sense. It's dafka until ema banim smecha, not halaluka, because halaluka belongs to the next chapter. Uman damar at B'tzeis Yisrael, and the opinion that says until B'tzeis Yisrael savar ad velo ad bichlal. He holds that it means until B'tzeis Yisrael, but what? But not including that phrase. So the Gemara says, ad halaluka. So why don't you just go ahead and once again say what you mean? Say that according to Beis Shammai, you go ahead and you say until halaluka. Maybe you'll say because you don't know which halaluka that refers to. Ad halaluka B'tzeis Yisrael. So instead, just say halaluka B'tzeis Yisrael. To which the Gemara says, kasha. So we'll say, therefore, again, what comes out from this sugya is so incredibly dramatic. What we have over here is we'll say, so interestingly enough, the only thing that everyone agrees on authorship about is Az Yashir, right? And that's a pretty easy one, right? Because Az Yashir is stated explicitly in the Torah. After Az Yashir, so we get into a whole bunch of dispute. Again, Hallel, who said it? Was it said at a specific time? Was it Nevi'im? Or again, perhaps the approach of the Chuvah Me'abba, which I personally like. That approach that says it could very well be that conceptually Hallel was created already at Yam Suf, which makes sense. So the concept was created ultimately again at Yam Suf. It could be that the construct doesn't come until later on. Sefer Tehillim, was it Klal Yisrael at Yam Suf? Was it all David HaMelech? Okay. So this is the machlokes. Part of the machlokes and the beauty of the machlokes is the ability to read in different authors and different experiences into all of these words, which is sometimes what makes, let's say, a Sefer Tehillim so incredibly impactful. That it's the words of David HaMelech, but it's the experiences of Klal Yisrael. Incredible. So let's go back to V'chosei Megula. Remember again. So the Mishnah said that you have to close off the Magid section with Geula. Amar Rava, Kriyas Shema v'Halel Ga'al Yisrael. Ditzalusa Goal Yisrael. So we'll say Rava makes an interesting distinction over here. He says when it comes to Kriyas Shema and Hallel, the concluding bracha is Gaal Yisrael. In Shmona Esrei, we make a bracha of Goel Yisrael. So we'll say, remember again, Gaal Yisrael is a statement. Goel Yisrael is an anticipatory statement, right? The Redeemer, present, future. So the Gemara says, why is tefillah different? My time, because tefillah is supplicatory. So because tefillah is supplicatory, ultimately I'm asking for something. So there's between stating something, stating a truth, versus asking for something. In Kriyas Shema and Hallel, I'm stating a truth. In Shemona Esrei, I'm making a request. Amar Rav Zera Dikidusha. Both the same idea. In Kiddush, we say Kachenu b'mitzvosav. Right? I'm sorry. In Kiddush we say Hashem b'mitzvosav, right? We say Hashem who has sanctified us, a statement, and commanded us. In davening we say Kachinu b'mitzosecha, sanctify us, request. So we'll say just making this distinction. Tefillah, which is inherently supplicatory, always contains requests. Kiddush is a statement. So the Gemara says, my time, but why is tefillah different? Ultimately, again, because tefillah is rachamim, tefillah is supplicatory. You always have to make mention of Yitzias Mitzrayim in Kiddush. Ksiv hacha leman tiskar es yom, says over here by Mitzrayim, you should remember the day you left Egypt. Uksiv hasam zachar es yom Shabbos lekacho. So both say uses zachar by Shabbos and Pesach, and therefore every single time you make Kiddush, you must remember Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim. Amar Rabba Bar Shila, Ditzalusa Matzmiach Keren Yeshua. In davening we say, he who brings forth or he who causes to flourish, Keren Yeshua, the horn of salvation. Da'aftarta, yet in the Haftorah we say Magen David, the shield of David. Vasisa lecha shim gadol kishim gidolim. Taner of Yosef, zeu shomer Magen David. And where do we get this from? Because the pasuk says, "I will make for you a great name, like the names of the great ones." That references the fact that we say Magen David, the shield of David. We'll say one last before we have Tzap Shim and Lakish. Vaschalagai gadol. I will make you into a great nation. We say God of Avram. Is God talking to? Remember, we'll say this is Lech Lecha. So when a Chaj Baruch Hu says to Avram, "I'll make you into a great nation," we say God is referred to as Elokei Avram. I will bless you. This refers to the fact that we say God of Yitzchak, Vagad Lo Shmecha, make your name great. Zeu Shom Elokei Yaakov. We say the God of Yaakov. So we'll say, I might have thought. So we'll say the Gemara is saying over here. We saw some brachas. That the idea, this pasuk is actualized in Shmona Esrei. That you say Elokei Avram, Elokei Yitzchak, Velokei Yaakov. So the Gemara says, you might have thought that therefore you should conclude the bracha of Avos, saying Baruch Atah Hashem, Magen Avram Yitzchak v'Yaakov. Therefore the Gemara says, Tamalomar v'yei bracha. Avram, you will be a bracha. B'cha chosmin vein chosmin v'kulan. We will end off with you, Avram, but we will not end off with everyone else. So we'll make mention of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, but v'yei bracha, Avram, you are the bracha. I'll just end off with this. Rabbi Yitzchak Berdichev says so beautifully. What's the pshat with this? What's the pshat? He says the avos all represent different midos. Avram Avinu was the midah of ava, or the midah of chesed, love, kindness. Yitzchak was gevura, strength, austerity, din, strict justice. Yaakov Avinu was interesting. Yaakov Avinu sometimes is referred to as MS, truth, or tiferes, splendor. So Rabbi Yitzchak says something beautiful. In life, we see different things. Sometimes we see chesed, sometimes we see HaKadosh Baruch Hu's din, and sometimes we see HaKadosh Baruch Hu's truth. But at the end of the day, when we say Baruch Atah Hashem Magen Avram, the Rebbe says so beautifully, is to always understand that everything HaKadosh Baruch Hu does for us and with us is always motivated from a profound sense of divine love. Baruch Atah Hashem Magen Avram, everything in life that we experience only comes from the Ribbon Shalom's Midas HaChesed and Midas HaAhava. Sometimes you could see it, sometimes you could experience, sometimes you don't, but it's always there. All right, so stop over, pick up, minute session over here tomorrow.